Hi everybody, Mrs. Tortolo here with another book about the civil rights movement. So this book is called Sit-In, How Four Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down. And it's by Andrea Davis Pinkney and illustrated by Brian Pinkney. So remember, we've been talking about what the civil rights movement was. Civil rights means equal rights for everybody, right? So after slavery was over, there came this period of time called segregation when black and white people were separated. And then starting in the 50s and 60s, a lot of really brave people stood up and fought against segregation and said, no, we want civil rights. We want equal rights. So this month, we've been learning about many different ways that people stood up and said, no, I disagree with that. We learned about Audrey Faye Hendricks, the 9-year-old girl who went to jail, right? That was how she marched, and she held a sign and she went to jail. I think probably in your classrooms you've learned about Rosa Parks, and the way that she protested was she didn't give up her seat in the bus. So this book is about a form of protest called a sit-in. So we're going to read this book and we're going to learn what it means to have a sit-in. And this book takes place in 1960. So about 5 years after Rosa Parks and about 3 years before Audrey Faye Hendricks marched. So it was a long period of time. This fight for equal rights didn't happen overnight. It took about 10 years for it to fully happen. So here we go. Sit in. How four friends stood up by sitting down. I like that. They were standing up for their rights, but they did it by sitting down. We must meet hate with love. Those were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words that got them started. Four hungry friends, eager to eat. Each took a seat at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezel sat quiet and still, with hearts full of hope, with Dr. King's words strong and close. They were college students with a plan. It was February 1st, 1960. So this is about 60 years ago that this took place. And it's in North Carolina. That's where this began. They didn't need menus. Their order was simple: a donut and coffee with cream on the side. Woolworth's was busy, so the friends waited patiently, silently, without a fuss. They were the only black kids at the counter. David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezel sat while everyone else got served. At first, they were treated like the hole in a donut, invisible. Others tried to ignore them. The waitress watched and refused them. There was a sign on the wall: whites only. This was the law's recipe for segregation. Its instructions were easy to follow. Do not combine white people with black people. Segregation was a bitter mix. Now it was the friends' turn to ignore and refuse. They ignored the law and they refused to leave until they were served. These kids had a recipe too, a new brew called integration. So segregation, separate, keeping black and white people together. Integration, black and white together. Their recipe was just as simple: combine black with white to make sweet justice. For them, integration was better than any chef's special. Integration was finer than homemade cake. Integration was a recipe that would take time. So David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezel sat quiet and still with hearts full of hope, with Dr. King's words strong and close. Be loving enough to absorb evil. So anytime you see these big words like this, those are quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. They sat straight and proud and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side. After sitting and waiting and wanting, a police officer came. But the four friends would not leave. The police officer didn't know what to do. The students were doing nothing wrong. No crime in sitting, no harm in being quiet. No danger in looking hungry. The officer left the lunch counter without doing anything. The Woolworths man turned off the lights. He announced, "Woolworths is closed." So the customers left, including the 4 friends who went home to dinner, where they were served first. So that was day 1, just 4 of them. They sat there all day and never got anything to eat or drink. News had already spread about the sit-in. David Joseph Franklin and Easel got their names in the paper. The next day, February 2nd, 1960, more students showed up at the lunch counter, sitting still for what was right. No reservations needed at Woolworths. The students seated themselves. They were dressed in their best clothes. They were polite and determined. No guesswork for the waitress. The young people knew the menu by heart. They ordered. No food came. So they sat in silence and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side. The waitress reminded them, whites only. But those kids wouldn't budge. They didn't move. Until they were served, they refused. All they wanted was some food. A donut and coffee with cream on the side. To pass the time, the students read their school books. They wrote in their journals. They finished their homework. They didn't need to read the menu, so they studied for tomorrow's test. There they are doing their homework. What had started in Greensboro spread faster than a grease fire. Soon, there were lunch counter protests in Hampton, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, Montgomery, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, and many other southern towns. So remember how we were talking about how segregation was in the southern states. So all of these sit-ins, lots of different states in the South started having sit-ins. If lunch counters could go from whites only to all welcome, if segregation could become integration, if black and white people could break bread together, everyone would pass the test. Everybody would score high, A+ with that coffee and cream on the side. But many folks were not motivated to make that grade. As the sit-ins grew, angry people gave the students a big dose of hatred, served up hot and heaping. Coffee poured down their backs. Milkshakes flung in their faces. Pepper thrown in their eyes. Ketchup, not on the fries, but dumped on their heads. They yelled at the students, "We don't serve your kind. Go home. Goodbye." The students wanted to lash out, but they couldn't. They wanted to strike back, but they didn't. Sitting still was so hard. Practicing peace while others showed hatred was tougher than any school test. Now there were news cameras filming the sit-ins and viewers at home watching it all on TV. The students were more determined than ever to show the world the true meaning of peace. So they sat in silence with hearts full of hope, with Dr. King's dream true and close. These were the words that kept them going. And remember, the big colorful words are always going to be quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. We must meet violence with nonviolence. The students sat still and proud and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side. Soon the sit-ins grew bigger and wider. White students joined their black friends to protest the unfair treatment by restaurant owners who would not serve food to black patrons. They also opposed segregated libraries, buses, parks, and pools. With so many students gathered, people got scared there would be fighting. They were afraid of all those youngsters grouped together for a cause. Even though the students were committed to peace, the police took action. They accused the students of loafing. Loafing, it's a weird word, right? Loafing, sort of an old-fashioned term. It means like hanging around without spending any money. They arrested them. They took them to jail. The students did not resist. They did not fight. Instead, they sang freedom songs to keep the peace. They held Dr. King's words steady and close. Demonstrate calm dignity. Soon folks were so busy arguing about who was right and who was wrong that they stopped going to Woolworths and other segregated places. Some shops were forced to integrate to keep their businesses alive, but the struggle was far from over. In April, an activist named Ella Baker organized a student leadership conference in North Carolina to help the young demonstrators. With Ella, the students formed a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Inspired by Dr. King, they came up with powerful words of their own. These are the words that became their slogan. We are all leaders. When President John F. Kennedy got a taste of their integration, he didn't sit in, he stepped in. On June 11th, 1963, the president went on TV. He urged Americans to treat each other fairly. You notice that date though, 1963? So these lunch counter protests began in 1960. That was 3 years. He then told Congress to take action against segregation. This became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson made the act a law. It banned segregation in public places. The hard work and courage of those brave students paid off. They had taken a bite out of segregation. Now it was time to savor equality. Now they were ready for a big sip of freedom. Their order was simple. A double dose of peace with nonviolence on top. Hold the hate, leave off the injustice. Now the students had the right recipe for integration. The steps were easy to follow. Start with love, add conviction, season with hope, extra faith to flavor, mix black people with white people, let unity stand, fold in change, sprinkle with dignity, bake until golden, serve immediately, makes enough for all. See how it's like a recipe? After weeks of sitting when their backsides ached, after months of being still when their feet fell asleep, after years of praying for laws to change, when they were so hungry for equality, the young people finally got what they ordered. It was worth the wait. It was served to them exactly how they wanted it. Well done. And oh, integration sure tasted good. These courageous young people enjoyed every bit. They came back to Woolworths for seconds and thirds and for many helpings after that. When the sit-ins were all done, the students left a big tip. A donut and coffee with cream on the side is not about food, it's about pride. These were the words that filled them up. And there we go, there's just a timeline at the end that kind of shows all of the different protests that took place to help end segregation. So there we go, that is Sit-In, How 4 Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down. And it's a true story. And if you look on the Google Classroom, I posted some pictures and you can see pictures of the real students and what happened to them during the sit-in. So there we go. I hope you like the story.